This session is going to talk about current perspective in the Western countries, and we have our distinguished panels. President Rajab Medani, President of Albania, President Petru Luciniu of Moldova, President Emil Constantinescu from Romania, and President Victor Yushchenko of Ukraine. And we have with us Professor Kazu Takahashi as the rapporteur. And we're going to start with President Rajab Medani, President of Albania, who's going to give us a view about the current perspective in the Western countries from his point of view. Mr. President, please.
Thank you very much. It's okay?
Yes.
The terrorism and violent extremism, the refugee crisis, and the rise of populism across the Western countries, including the Brexit and its consequences, have already punctured the self-confidence of the Western countries. In Europe, the influence of the right wing and of nationalist groups is increased through an anti-immigration propaganda. They also are calling for a return to a pure and old vision of the nation. On the other side, the globalization of radical Islam has inspired within Western countries a tendency of self-exclusion, refusing the integration and multiculturalism, cohesion and adoption of Muslim communities emigrated in these countries. This exclusion, or better, self-exclusion, is serving often as a feedback system for radicalization and terrorism. A new concern, even a threat, in the Western countries is the exploded populism, which is taking also the shape of an anti-establishment movement. Even more, the politicians who fan the fears of the public are playing on the economic difficulties to promote hatred and xenophobia, emphasizing or strengthening security measures on the back of the freedom and human rights. To understand better this new wave of populism, I believe a simple parallel between the Great Recession and the Great Depression is useful. How this Great Recession is influenced the Western politics. In fact, during the Great Depression, the worldwide GDP fell by an estimated 15% between 1929 and 1932, while during the Great Recession, between 2008 and 2009, the worldwide GDP fell by less than 1%. The Great Depression had devastating effects in countries both rich and poor. Personal income, tax revenue, profits and prices dropped, while international trade plunged by more than 50%. Unemployment in the United States rose to 25%, and in some countries rose as high as 33%. It had fueled the rise of extremist populist movement in various European countries, like Hitler's Nazi movement in Germany, Mussolini's fascist movement in Italy, Franco's nationalist movement in Spain, etc. As a consequence, a war was broken out in 1939. During the Great Recession, in comparison, the populism has troubled the politics of the West. However, this populist revolution, if we quoted it, still has a long way to go. Above all, this populist motion is pretending a new world order, or at least the destruction of the old one. It is a kind of revolt that is rising throughout America and Europe, including core European Union nations. The populism has fueled the Farage campaigning during the Brexit or Trump campaigning in the United States. By voting to leave the European Union, the British people showed that integration of the West is neither inevitable nor irreversible. A message that Trump's campaign drove home by calling for the United States to pull back from its commitments around the world and to focus on America first. In this new situation, the first question is, are the international agreements of the past up for the renegotiations? Or another question, are the interests of the nation states not bound more by an established global order? In fact, the growing anti-establishment, anti-immigration, and pro-nationalist sentiments have fueled right-wing electoral gains across Europe. Even Germany, which looks like a stable pillar of the Western world, is suffering a mass migration across it. A last poll found that 42% of Germans want a referendum on the European Union membership, which is pumping re-emergence of state egotism and nationalism. A similar situation is spread everywhere in Europe. The populism in Western countries comes in wide varieties of flavors, as left-wing or as right-wing. The populists are united in pitting the people against the powerful, the political establishment, and traditional institutions, either corrupted or left behind by technological change. For example, Spain's left wing, Podemos, bashes La Casta. Britain's right-wing Independence Party is demonizing the liberal elite. In Italy, Beppe Grillo's group rails against 3 destroyers for him: journalists, industrialists, and politicians. And we see the same thing everywhere in Europe. Similar as populism shaped the years 1920s, 1930s, the populist explosion of today is unlikely to be a mere temporary aberration. Different parties and movements are representing a new tendency, draws on a deep well of discontent with the status quo. In reality, technocratic elites lost much of their credibility in the global financial crisis in 2008 and later. But the strength of populist motion is primarily due to the explosion in economic and geographic inequalities. However, for some optimist analysts, the populism is simply a protest movement, dangerous and disruptive, but doomed by the advance of globalization and multiculturalism, which are in turn driven by irreversible technological and demographic forces. It is true. I don't believe that it's true. In fact, a glance of history suggests that this view is questionable. Globalization went into rapid reverse in the first quarter of the 20th century, despite the spread of new technologies like telephone or airplane. In this sense, we don't know what comes next, and what we are waiting for is not quite clear. So also these questions which are being treated here, I don't believe that the answer is clear. For me, after the Second World War, for more than a generation, the Western elites settled into a consensus on most major issues, fed by a marriage based on the benefits of free trade, new technologies, and immigration. But their uniformity on the basic questions slowly has created many problems, threatening the mainstream, particularly the financial economic crisis and different inequalities have helped the Western populists like Farage, Le Pen, or Great Wilders and the others to increase their audience these last years. What they want is not the European Union, but a mosaic of states in Europe, instead of an integrated Commonwealth with a common market, shared currency, and open borders. What they prefer is national states and borders. In short, they prefer for Europe to look more like it was before the European Union's grand experiment. Never mind that this smart experiment was designed to prevent the nations of Europe from engaging in an endless cycle of wars. On the eve of the vote for his elections, Reagan describes America as a shining city on a hill, a country that could contribute to keep the world safe. He dreamed of an America that is not turned inward, but outward, an America which is turned toward others. By contrast, Mr. Trump has sworn to put America first. Also, he will no longer surrender this country or its people to the false song of globalism, what he say. Differently of Reagan's America, which was optimist, Trump's approach is linked to the economic protectionism, or a kind of nationalism. Worse, the leaders of Russia, China, Turkey, etc., are embracing a pessimist view that foreign affairs are often a zero-sum game in which global interests compete with national ones, where the last ones are more important. It is a big change towards a less global world and more closed one. And that tendency, I believe, must be stopped. Otherwise, it will be quite dangerous. In fact, the civic nationalism, or so-called patriotism, inclusive patriotism, is appealing to universal values, such as freedom and equality. It contrasts with ethnic nationalism, which is a zero-sum, aggressive, and nostalgic. In its darkest hours, in the first half of the 20th century, ethnic nationalism led to war. Today, the ethnic nationalism is strengthened everywhere. In Russia, Vladimir Putin has shown the mixed values for the Russian and Slavic traditions and Orthodox Christianity. In Turkey, Erdogan has turned away from the European Union in favor of a kind of Islamic nationalism. In India, Modi remains outward-looking and modernizing, but he has ties to radical ethnic nationalist Hindu groups. In China, the nationalism has become so angry that the leading party struggles to control it. But while the ethnic nationalism has prospered during these years, what is happening on the world's greatest experiment in post-nationalism, which is the European Union? The architects of the European Union believe that nationalism, which has dragged Europe into 2 world wars, would die. Also, it was that the national rivalry was passed with a series of nested identities in which people could be Alsatian, French or German, and European all at once. This was their idea. However, in many parts of the European Union, this never happened. And we have seen this also during this referendum for the Constitution at 2004. As a consequence, the British are leaving the European Union, and in former communist countries such as Poland and Hungary, power has passed to xenophobic nationalists. This is the situation today. There is even a small but growing threat in France. And if this right wing will win in France, this will destroy the European Union. Also, the Trump's new nationalism or his economic protectionism at home, it tends to produce intolerance and to feed doubts about minorities, while abroad regional global problems will become harder to resolve without the United States. Also, for Trump, if America allies are failed to pay for the security they receive, then he is threatening to walk away from them. And if it happens, the result will be this one: a harsher and more unstable world, especially for small countries that today are protected by global rules and international institutions. However, my hope is that America will not abandon its global vision. What to do? In this new situation, as a matter of urgency, is that globalization must be fundamentally reorientated, particularly to consider the main challenges of our time: rise in inequality, and global warming. Therefore, we need to push the active politics to draft and implement new treaties, enabling us to respond to these challenges. In this sense, in my view, the question of liberalizing trade should no longer be the main focus. There should be no signing of international agreements that reduce custom duties and other commercial barriers without including quantified and binding measures to combat fiscal and climate dumping. It is no longer possible to negotiate trade treaties for free trade without nothing in exchange. For example, in my view, the new European Union-Canada free trade is not a balanced treaty. This strictly commercial treaty contains absolutely no restrictive measures concerning fiscal or climate issues. Summarizing, it's time for me to resize some of the concept of globalization. In this sense, trade is a good thing, but fair and sustainable development demands also public services, infrastructure, health and education. In terms for that, fair taxation systems are needed. If we fail to deliver all these demands and challenges, the anti-establishment motion will prevail everywhere. In fronting that, it is necessary to develop a clear strategy that meets the need and the rights of ordinary people, including public investments, development strategies, halting climate change, reducing poverty, creating jobs, supporting small business. Of course, the trade will play its part in building a better world, but it requires a serious rethink on its mechanism and policies, including an integrated society based on the shared society model. Particularly, we need a real approach to diversity, which is the essence of multiculturalism, different of simple assimilation and integration process, which has produced what we have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, President Medani, for shedding a light on the increasing nationalistic wave that is taking place everywhere in the world. And now we're going to hear from President Petru Lucinciu, President of Moldova, who is going to give us his views. Mr. President.
Господа, мы участвуем очередной раз в конференции, которая организовывается под эгидой Центра Низами. На этот раз организатором непосредственным является
This time and in this visit to the Arab Republic of Egypt and compared to the other conferences, we have reached a material for working on facilitating our meetings so that what all we say will express our professionalism. Also, what Mr. Ismail Serageldin said, I think that we shall thank three people in particular who supported this conference. First, the organizer, Dr. Ismail Serageldin, and Mr. Rafsha Muradov, and Mr. Ibrahimov, who's not here now, but under his sponsorship, he organized this conference. I want not to repeat what have already been said, because everything is important, but along 70 years after the Second World War, a lot of democratic states directed attention to human rights. And now we face a new problem. A lot of the region's countries are exposed to radical and extremist and violent attacks. I understand that we all understand fully what is happening. But we ask, what shall we do? With our colleagues here who've been presidents to other countries, we made numerous recommendations for putting a mechanism to carry out what we say. Otherwise, we will say a lot, and that will be only on papers. We need to understand the reasons that caused the current situation. In 2 days of dialogue, I want to say that we have 4 reasons. The first reason is the violent conflicts, the armed conflicts that struck a lot of countries in Central Africa and the Middle East. In addition to many changes that happened in the West, the third one is the essential gap between the poor and the rich. Like 5% of the population have like 95% of the resources of the country and of the wealth of the country. We have another reason, that's the lack of intervention from the leading countries who don't play their due role. We have the advanced countries, they don't play the crucial role needed to put an end to the conflict. We have to be united together to carry out our objectives so that we can change that status quo. In 2017, we need to consider how we will solve these problems. We talked about the Secretary General of the United Nations for the essential changes to the international order and the changes submitted before all of us. I am sure that through the United Nations we have to develop the mechanisms for the quick and effective response and solution to the problems we face. On the other hand, I'm not sure that this will happen soon. Countries like the United States start a new term with a new president. No one knows how the situation will be through the first year of his presidency. He says that he will pay attention to the internal affairs of concern to the American citizen. What about the other conflicts? Another issue related to the European Union, Germany and France, maybe Italy. Lots of things might change significantly, and Mr. Maidani talked about this. On the other hand, we have to consider the powers that work to strike a balance and put an end to violence and extremism. They use non-effective methods and approaches. The European organizations face a lot of burdens. So they tackle these conflicts in a delayed manner. The advanced and developed countries have to work hard and exert a lot of efforts in order to eradicate poverty and put an end to the deeply rooted problems in all of the countries, and also to tackle the economic and political issues and problems. Humanity has a lot of differences. Let's take a look at the October revolution in Russia that took place. If we take a look at the main reason for the Russian Revolution, it was the huge gap between the poor and the rich. We have to develop the programs that will improve these countries and the countries that export a lot of refugees or that produce a lot of refugees, so that we need to solve issues like the unemployment. So after the World War II in Europe, after the Marshall Plan, we know that we have an organization that's called G7, G8 or G20, something like this. Those are the rich countries who have a lot of potentials, who have a lot of capabilities. I understand that the world must face extremism, violence, and terrorism. We should be united so that we can save the planet. We have to provide the essential financing and funding and potential capabilities in order to ensure a better future for humanity. Democracy is the best of, and the most important of these elements that we should keep and protect, because through these we can achieve the mechanisms that will provide us with the democracy and developing democracy in a lot of countries. We have to reach an international agreement to prevent any military interventions from other countries in the non-territorial countries. We have to reduce violence. We have to. Okay, so what happened in Syria? It's a peaceful country, including a number of countries intervened in what's happening. So what happened after that? So in order to ensure peace and security and also human rights, this is something that we cannot separate. We have to have limits for cooperation and how to manage such a cooperation in the international community. If the international community can communicate together so that they can define their potentials, we don't disagree with that, of course. This is the culture of these societies. And when we intervene trying to impose changes to the countries, this will lead to huge problems. We say that freedom is essential, and it's very important. We have to provide the important aspects for the society. As what happened in the United States after the 9/11 attacks, a lot of changes had been carried out. But the society, the American society, understand the importance of carrying out such changes and modifications. On the other hand, how can we put an end to this conference, the current conference? How can we develop a mechanism or like a document for what has been said in the conference? Like Ms. Farida said, we can't just talk. We need to take action. When we used to be in the presidency with the assistance of our advisor, and we find that we have a conference in Cairo of including more than 16 former presidents and prime ministers and prominent figures. So the country that should should produce such a document, we have to put it into consideration. This kind of statement, this kind of document shall be effective, and we can move it to the practical and the application part. Now, we can say that the dialogue taking place today is really fruitful. We attend a lot of conferences and face a lot of different situations. However, sometimes the speeches are very optimistic. However, when we meet those people in the evening, they say something else. They say something very pessimistic. Again, what I say is the country and the states is not just facing the danger of war or internal conflicts, they are also facing the importance of considering their own interests, so that the state can get rid of such threats imposed by terrorist groups like ISIS. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we really do hope that this distinguished elite gathering and Congress will result in a concrete plan of action that will be considered by different countries and different states. We hope so. Our next speaker on the panel is President Emil Constantinescu, President of Romania. Mr. President.
Thank you, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, let me to focus my intervention on the failure of the politically correctness ideology and on necessity for a policy based on the realities of a fast-changing world. The organizers of the conference, Democratic Security in the time of extremist and violence, dedicated this session to the examination of the current perspectives of Western countries. Realizing that today, as such politicians in every country who fund the fears of the public, who play on the economic difficulties, promote hatred and xenophobia, point to the presence of minorities and the difficulties of cultural assimilation, we are invited to answer the following question. Is there more debate, more participation sufficient to check the advance of the populist xenophobes? My answer, we do not need more debates, but different debates, because the mentality of an important part of the Western society, especially of the young generation, has been changing rapidly during the last 20 years. Two important electoral events, the referendum for Great Britain's exit of European Union and the presidential election in the United States, have pointed out for the first time since the end of the World War II that the populist and anti-minorities and anti-foreigners rhetoric is not longer the exclusive feature of some small ultranationalist parties, but was adopted by political leaders representing large historical parties, British Conservative and American Republicans, traditional guardians of democratic values. On the other hand, this message was ratified through the ballots by the majority of the population, which underlines a major change in the democratic belief of citizens of the two large countries that created the Western democracy model. In this context, we can no longer be confined only to a public condemnation of the populist and ultranationalist leaders' rhetoric, but we have to ask ourselves what was wrong in the speech promoted by democratic political leaders, civil society, and democratic media. In my opinion, we have to start by accepting the failure of the politically correct concept, originating from a fair idea, avoiding misdemeanor to other persons and respecting human dignity. It became an ideology which, by promoting an egalitarian rhetoric, failed to solve both the discrimination and the discrepancies, and just shifting them from the official framework to an informal one, where they kept accumulating and radicalizing. For us, who lived under half of century under the communist dictatorship, it is clear the meaning of the langue du bois in French, and in English, stiff language of the state propaganda, which failed to solve conflict by froze them only. This ethnic, national, and social conflict were extremely difficult to manage by our democracies established in Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of communist dictatorship, communist regime in 1989. And my friends from Albania, Moldova, Ukraine, Baltic countries, and Balkan countries know very well this situation. Where we are aware as well that all ideologies based on utopias end up in authoritarian regimes. On the other hand, now utopic approaches divert our focus from the changes that the IT influence in society induced to the mentality of a large part of the population worldwide, especially in the developed countries. Ladies and gentlemen, all knows Oxford Dictionary. Each year, a group of experts from Oxford dictionaries choose the word of the year, considered to be representative for the world state of mind that year. In 2016, post-truth was chosen. Post-truth defined by Oxford Dictionary as a term relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion or personal belief. The prefix in post-truth, post, says Oxford Dictionary, has a meaning more like belonging to a time in which the specified concept has become unimportant or irrelevant. If we examine words chosen in previous years by Oxford Dictionary, we observe a certain dynamic influenced by social networks. In 2009, word of the year was unfriend, which means deleting someone from the list of social network friends. In 2012, word of the year was GIF, graphic interchange format, an image or video sequence especially relating to an event used by internauts to mock circumstances which soon afterward become viral on internet. In 2013, word of the year was selfie, a photograph that one has taken of oneself, typically one taken with a smartphone or webcam, and uploaded to a social media website. In fact, this represents an exhibition of narcissists followed in mass by millions of others in the true herd spirit fashion of virtual communities. Coming back to post-truth, it is representative not only for a society of lies in which we are bombarded with distorted news, not only for politician lies and demagogy, but also in the case of democratic elections is characteristic for a part of the electorate who takes over populist lies, identifies with them, and becomes accomplice at deforming reality. The other part of the electorate who is indifferent or passive is ultimately accomplice too, because it permits to the former to become a majority. None of current approaches can help us manage the serious challenges of the world of tomorrow, with society traumatized by the obsession of risk involved by the European integration and the globalization. The traumatized societies are those whose leaders are not able to explain either the historical project mission or the balance between its gains and cost. Citizens' capacity to support important projects must not be underestimated. That is why I believe that the long way towards a European solidarity must begin with each nation, local community, or even family. There we can often find many of the contradictions we describe as typical gaps between North and South, or West and East, on a global perspective. And we can also identify the identity bond of a common ethos. We speak about a common European identity founded on shared values. What are these values that define the European identity? How could be surpassed but not forgotten the specific characteristic and even the national limits on the way towards a common identity? A long way to Tipperary. The answer of the questions lies in the very heart of the European project, but also in the European anxieties. If we continue to create projects without taking into account the inevitable anxieties involved by a political construction of 500 million inhabitants, we have poor changes to develop a powerful and democratic Europe. I'm very interested in this discussion because I have assumed, as a professor and intellectual in the statement, a great deal of answer to these questions. I do believe in the future of Europe. I do believe in the future of the world. But I trust in the capacity, especially of capacity of young Europeans to conceive and to build the Europe of tomorrow, the world of tomorrow. My generation uses to refer to European values by bringing into discussion democracy, freedom, citizens' equality, many times using this word without thinking about their substance. What means in the age of global communication to make Europe a participative democracy? To support a practice of frequent public consultation, to include the electronic referendum in the current institutional mechanism, to conceive an administration not only on local and national level, but also on a European one, and that could reorganize as a governance in accordance with the new communication ways. No doubt, we should improve the informational methods. But what are the mental methods that we are familiar with today? Europe, an important actor in a world fastly evolving, has not always known to give its citizens the place that were destined to hold. many citizens, most of them young people, doubt Europe, the way it was created and its development rhythm, the difficulty to conciliate the aspirations, even the prejudices with this huge European project should confront concrete aspects, equally intellectual and practical, as often beyond preconceived ideas lies real questions and problems, waiting for an answer from our present and future decision makers. Thank you.
Thank you, President Constantinescu. And yes, indeed, we don't need more debates, but different debates. And I thank you for your optimistic note in believing in the younger generation that they are going to make a difference and optimistic view. Our next intervener is going to be President Viktor Yushchenko, President of Ukraine. Mr. President.
Уважаемый председатель, уважаемые коллеги,
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, dear participants, I'd like to start the dialogue without a long introduction. I'd like to thank you for organizing such a dialogue, and I'd like to express my opinion in these issues raised in the conference. It's terrorism. I liked the discussion that we had yesterday. We tackled the causes, the outcomes of violence and the reactions towards it, and towards what's happening in this sophisticated world. One of the important issues that I would like to comment on is my stance towards what's happening. We are generally talking with my Arab friends that sometimes the outside world is not understanding what's happening exactly in the Arab world. This is very important, and this is really happening. And I want to say that me, myself, I don't understand what's happening actually in the Arab world. This is my own personal point of view. We understand how to solve our regional and local issues, but we can hardly we can hardly predict it. However, we know after the terrorist attack, how should we manage it? For example, we know how to deal with some kind of attack or explosion in a restaurant, in a train, or any kind of firing against the citizens, a kind of car bomb or a car that tramps over a lot of people that leads to tens of deaths. The leaders of Europe, in this case, express their solidarity and visit the stricken state. They stand together in one line and say that they don't understand why this happened. They show solidarity for such issue. And consequently, they say that it's really important to face such evil. As I said, we deal with the issue after the attacks, after the terrorist attacks. So we have a lot of effective measures trying to review the security measures locally and internationally, and some of the criminals are arrested and imprisoned, and so on. We are used to deal with the terrorist attacks after it happens on the local and international and regional level. But if this happens on a weekly basis and an organized and regular basis, and lots of people dies like every week, and in 1 year, or to be more precise, on over the 2.5 past years, like 10,000 people died due to the terrorist attacks. It has become a very tragic event, and the statistics are huge. What I want to say that, for example, I'm talking about the conflict in eastern Ukraine. You know that the conflict, this conflict, we cannot call it war. And that's the view of my European friends. They say what's happening in eastern Ukraine, that's like anti-terrorist acts. They talk about the volume and gravity of such acts, but the occupation of the Ukrainian territories, we have thousands of tanks, missiles, anti-tank missiles, and such artillery. A lot of statistics show numbers like 2,000 of such missile systems or tanks and so on. We have a kind of also anti-aircrafts and anti-missiles and other military weapons and equipment. With such equipment, we have also more than 30,000 Russian troops positioned in many states in Don, Crimea, Chechnya. Such a military fleet and weapons that are set in occupied territory, we have, they are like exceed the number of the German troops. So what is the cost needed for buying such, we buy such weapons? When we talk about a territory that's been sieged and annexed to the Russian territories. So I would like to announce to the dear participants, and very calmly, I will say that the first point that we want to specify to this issue, that the terrorist attacks taking place nowadays happen by terrorists, but the terrorist attacks that are happening now are carried out by organized groups of particular numbers, and they might be international organizations also, but rarely there are many events that destroy the security, stability, and the democracy of the international society. When the terrorist is used, exploited, funded, organized by some certain countries. We have to confess that this actually happens. If we don't understand and learn from the lesson and know how to face such kind of terrorism, it will be really difficult for us using these discussions and the cultural discussions, civilization discussions, diplomatic discussion, education, and so on. It will be difficult through all this to face other kinds of terrorism. We have another example that stresses My point, as you remember, like 1 year and a half before, on the occupied Ukrainian territories, and the Malaysian airplane has been shot down, and more than 200 people were killed. And today, we know the place and also the coordinates from which the missile has been launched, the missile that attacks the airplane. And we know that this is the missile system belongs to the Russian army, that we call and we understand which is the brigade that has such such missile system, and the leader, the military leader, is known, the person who gave the orders for shutting down the aircraft. We need to understand how to take the first political step to call terrorists a terrorists. You know that Archimedes said that the first step to define the truth and understand it accurately, so that we need to define it accurately, the truth, so that we can be courageous enough to understand what's happening. In Donbas, eastern Ukraine, almost 11,000 people have been killed so far, and tens of thousands of injured people over the past years. Whereas almost 14,000 people have been killed over 10 years, like almost similar figure. We believe that the terrorist Russian existence in Donbas leads to the 2 million refugees fled Donbas. Those refugees fled the place Donbas. That number is the biggest number of refugees that fled the European countries recently. There are a lot of important events, but we don't want to consider it and we don't want to focus on it. In all these events, we use we have some kind of format that we call it in the United Nations. We have some term for this from the United Nations. They said that it is the aggressor country. And the Ukrainian parliament, called LNR and DNR, described the events as terrorist events. So that we can reach general political resolutions. Such resolutions are not effective, are not very much effective. Relating to the Ukrainian example, in 1994, as you know, Ukraine disassembled its nuclear weapons, dismantled its Ukrainian weapons, and the Ukrainian arsenal of nuclear weapons was bigger than those owned by France and China altogether. And instead of such arsenal, we promised that the security and sovereignty of Ukraine will be maintained. Now, Ukraine has lost its sovereignty and some of its territories, and we cannot find someone to support us. Where are the guarantees that had been given to us by the nuclear countries in order to dismantle our nuclear arsenal? What about protecting, relating to protecting the whole world? Over the 22 past years in Eastern Europe, again in Eastern Europe, the democratic countries in Eastern Europe, 6 wars had took place. And over the 22 past years in 4 of such countries in Eastern Europe, they lost their independence and their sovereignty. That's happening now. While we are watching and listening to what's happening, we're not talking about Franco or Hitler. Today, Georgia lost part of its lands. Azerbaijan and other countries. We have to be aware that Europe and the whole world have tried a lot in order to define what's happening on the international arena. I think that in order to describe what's happening now in Eastern Europe, it is a continuous event. So, if we don't understand the problem really and giving it its real, true name, if we don't understand the disease, we won't be able to cure it. What I want to say here is that security and that talking about security, I want to be calm and I want to be correct and I want to be beneficial for you so that we can have a clear conclusion. The first and important conclusion here is that we have to be very frank and talk about Europe and the Arab world, that there are countries that are still using the politics of colonization and expansion, either economic, political expansion and seizing territories, and using the military and armed forces to realize that expansion. This is the main reason actually for the death of democracy and exposes the international community to terrorist attacks. I think that this terrorism is the founder of other forms of terrorism. If we cannot define it, if we cannot assert it, and we won't be able to overcome it and stop it eventually. Such a situation leads us to the fact that the world will try every time to burden a lot of victims and casualties. Today, we said that tens of thousands of people are victims of such attacks. We have lots and millions of refugees, and we need billions for reconstructions and for reconstructing the infrastructure. We have to confess that the world today doesn't possess the international or the regional capabilities and find the mechanism for intervention to put an end to terrorism practiced by some countries. So the world shows some weak, poor solidarity with those who've been stricken by such attacks. We don't have solutions for such issues. Look at the number of problems that we faced in Eastern Europe. The United Nations adopts resolutions and condemn the parties, provide solutions, but these United Nations solutions are not effective and they are not applied. So,
И никакая политическая схема
we don't put an end. We're not just like this. We don't put an end to such a crisis. They are not
Поэтому, на мой
solved.
взгляд,
I
достаточно
think
логично следующая
that
констатация.
it's logical and rational to have such the
Территория
following conclusion.
демократии сокращаются,
The democracy
даже в Европе, колыбели демократии.
are now weakened
А территория
either in
оккупации,
Europe, the cradle of democracy,
мне кажется, это
because we
определение
have
правильное.
some
И
occupied
последнее
territories
слово, которое хотелось бы
which are
сегодня сказать.
increasing. Finally,
Мы много говорили о том, как
I
правильно
said before
организовать
many times, and we said many times,
региональный,
that is
национальный
it
политический диалог.
correct to put
Как важно иметь
mechanism
образование
and political
21
dialogue on the
века.
international regional level.
Как важно за одним столом собирать
Now,
лидеров
in the 21st centuries,
политических,
how can we
религиозных,
gather the leaders, either political or
важен
religious
диалог
leaders, together?
культурная дипломатия.
how this we need to
Я бы
consider
еще
how
хотел в
important are
заключение
these
подчеркнуть.
dialogues. But I want to
Государство в
assert
21 веке должно
that
быть решением,
the state in the
проблемы
21st
терроризма,
century
а
should
не его
face
проблемы.
and overcome the problems
Спасибо
of
за внимание.
terrorism from its roots. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, President Yushchenko, for your intervention. And yes, indeed, you started your opening speech by saying that you don't really understand what's taking place in the Arab world, and I'm sure many in the Arab world are not really understanding what's taking place in your part of the world, that Ukraine has given all its nuclear arsenal just to protect its borders, and yet the agreements were not respected. Thank you very much for your intervention. I thank my panelists because we started late, but still we kept the time of the original session. I just would ask Professor Takahashi, our rapporteur, if he would like to add anything to what has been said. You would like to intervene, Professor Takahashi?
Madam, in the interest of time, I would say what I should say tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to go to lunch right now, but before going to lunch, Dr. Serageldin has an announcement to say regarding the program that I understand there has been some changes. Professor Dr. Serageldin.
Thank you. Yes, actually, Professor Takahashi, you may end up doing it today. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, I have had many requests, and I'm very sensitive to these requests, that having come all the way to Cairo, you should be entitled to see a little bit of our country. And as a result, I'm proposing, if you will all agree, that we compress a little bit ourselves. We finish by tonight, and tomorrow we can arrange both in English and Russian for those who want. With particular things, we can try to give you an overview of Egypt and Egypt's culture, at least as far as Cairo, with 4 major locations: the pyramids, the Egyptian Museum, the Citadel, and the Khan Khalili. Luxor would require a 2-day trip, and some people can make it, other people can't, but we can arrange for those who have 1 day. We can do a very good day with 4 major locations that you can visit. The Khan Khalili is in the heart of medieval Islamic Cairo. The pyramids, of course, represent the pyramids. I don't have to say what, but the Egyptian Museum is primarily the pharaonic period of Cairo, and the Citadel is one of the largest citadels in the world, and it was built by Saladin the Great in the 12th century and dominates the major city. So we will talk more about that, but if that is a general consensus, because I've had many requests from many people, then let us try to collaborate, to collapse the time, and really finish it tonight. Okay, I take it this is an approval from everybody. So you will be speaking at the last session,
listen
the
to
penultimate session tonight, not tomorrow.
Which time will begin tomorrow?
No,
No,
tomorrow
they will-
I'll talk to you right after lunch. I'll announce what the buses are and everything else. But right now, if that's the general decision, then we really want to try.
Let's please listen, please.
Please, let us.
He has not finished yet.
Let us please try to be back here no later than 2:15, so we can initiate this. This is now 1:15, lunch break. We meet at 2:15, and we will try to tighten the presentations and finish our program by tonight. So please, everybody will collaborate and
So
and
practically
hopefully
speaking,
we'll be
Dr.
able to-
Serageldin is saying that the sessions tomorrow are going to be done today. So all the sessions that should have taken place tomorrow are going to take place today, and the rapporteurs are going to give us their briefs tonight, so that we finish everything tonight, and you're all free to just visit Egypt, visit Cairo.
Tough schedule.
Any additional notes, Dr. Serageldin?
No, I think that's it. Just please be back here no later than 2:15 sharp. We start.
Here we start. By this, I thank my distinguished panelists for their interventions. I thank Dr. Serageldin, and bon appetit, everybody. We're going to go for lunch right now. Thank you very much.
Okay.